Hello and welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. Genuinely glad you found this. Get yourself settled before we go any further. Seriously, get your pillow sorted, pull whatever blanket you've got up a bit closer, turn the brightness down if you haven't already. There's absolutely no rush tonight. We're not going anywhere particularly exciting. Well, we are going somewhere very specific actually, but we're taking the slow road there. Tonight we're heading to a small mountain town in Colorado. Population, not very many, notable exports, constitutional crises, collective panic, and one or two very bewildered children. We're talking about South Park. And more specifically, we're spending tonight with the characters who've been living in that fictional Colorado Valley for nearly 3 decades now and looking at what's actually been going on underneath the surface with them all this time. I've been watching South Park for a genuinely embarrassing number of years, longer than I'd like to admit in polite company. I started watching it at an age when I absolutely should not have been watching it, and I've kept watching it through every iteration, every controversy, every creative reinvention since. And there's always been something about the show that I find quietly fascinating, which is this. It looks like nothing from the outside. It looks like crude paper-cut animation and rude jokes and shock humor with no deeper intention behind any of it. But if you've actually been paying attention, and I mean really paying attention, not just half watching it while you do something else entirely, the show has been doing genuinely interesting things with its characters for a very long time. Not every character. Some of them are just background furniture. But the core cast, the main boys, a handful of the recurring adults, 1 or 2 secondary kids who somehow developed into full people when no one was looking, there's more going on under those paper-cut faces than the surface suggests. That's what we're here for tonight. We'll move through the characters slowly. There's no agenda, no countdown, no particular destination in mind. If something sends me off on a tangent, I'll follow it. If we end up spending more time on one person than another, that's fine. Some of these characters have the full run of the show behind them and genuinely deserve the space. Others have 1 or 2 interesting things worth saying, and then we move on. Either way, the structure here is loose on purpose. These aren't chapters with conclusions. They're more like separate rooms in the same house. You can wander between them in any order, and if you fall asleep in one of them, you haven't missed anything essential. And if you do drift off somewhere in the middle, that's completely fine. That's honestly the whole point. But I suspect some of what we're going to get into tonight might keep you up a little longer than you were planning, because some of the things the show has done with these characters over the years are genuinely surprising, even to people who've been watching for a long time. One quick thing before we start: if you enjoy this sort of long, slow, character-focused deep dive and you'd like to hear more of them, subscribing to the channel is honestly the easiest way to not miss any. There's a button somewhere around the screen. No pressure at all. I just wanted to mention it once and then we can forget about it completely. Right, South Park. The show started in August of 1997. It was created by 2 men named Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who had made a couple of low-budget animated shorts a few years earlier that got passed around and became something of a cult sensation before most people had heard of viral anything. Comedy Central saw them, recognized that there was something strange and alive in what they were making, and gave them a series. That series has now been running for 28 seasons, which is a number that does something slightly alarming to my brain when I actually sit with it. 28 seasons. The show has been on the air longer than most of its current audience has been adults. It has outlasted multiple internet eras, multiple political cycles, multiple cultural moments that felt at the time like they would define a generation, and have since been completely forgotten. It has satirized things that no longer exist. It has satirized things that haven't finished existing yet. It has killed characters and brought them back and killed them again. It has reinvented itself 3 or 4 times without ever fully becoming a different show. And through all of that, at the center, there have always been 4 boys in Colorado: Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, Eric Cartman, Kenny McCormick. 4 kids at a bus stop in the snow. That's the image the show always returns to before an episode begins. before anything has happened, before the chaos starts. Just 4 small figures in winter coats, standing in falling snow, talking about something. What they're talking about changes every time, but the bus stop remains a recurring location. That image has been there since the very first episode. It'll probably still be there long after most of us have stopped watching. And something about the consistency of those 4 kids, unchanged, in the same place, in the same snow, is a large part of why the show still has a hold on people after all this time. So let's start with Stan, because Stan, more than any of the other boys, is the one the show is quietly, privately about, even if you'd never know it from the outside. Stan Marsh is, on the surface, the most straightforward character in the show. He's the everyman, the voice of reason, the one who reacts to all the insanity happening around him with something approaching a normal human response, which, in South Park, makes him almost comically out of place. He's usually the one who ends up articulating whatever moral the episode has been circling around. He's the steady center, or at least, that's the version of Stan you see if you watch the first few seasons and don't think too hard about it. Here's the thing about Stan Marsh. He's based on Trey Parker. Stan Marsh is loosely based on Trey Parker, not inspired by. Stan Marsh is loosely based on Trey Parker. Trey Parker has said outright in interviews that Stan is his animated stand-in. And once you know that, a fairly substantial amount of the show starts to make more sense. His dad in the show is named Randy. His mom is named Sharon. Those are the actual names of Trey Parker's real parents. His dad in the show is a geologist. That's what Trey Parker's real father did for a living. The house the Marsh family lives in looks like a house from the kind of Colorado suburb Parker grew up in. The dynamic between Stan and Randy, a slightly chaotic, often embarrassing dad being observed by a son who has to pretend he doesn't know him, maps pretty cleanly onto what Parker has described of his own childhood. None of this is a secret, exactly. Parker has been fairly open about it over the years. But it has some interesting implications for how Stan is written. When Stan is going through something, there's a reasonable chance that Trey Parker was going through something similar at the time. The two of them are running on roughly parallel tracks. Stan processes things slowly. He has a temper he mostly keeps in check. He genuinely cares about the people around him, even when they frustrate him endlessly. He is, of the 4 boys, one who tries hardest to be decent. He's also the one the show has put through the most genuine emotional difficulty. The episode that crystallized this for a lot of people is an episode from season 15 called You're Getting Old. Stan turns 10 years old, and suddenly, almost overnight, he starts experiencing the world differently. All music sounds to him like literal, actual fart sounds. Movies and TV shows look disgusting to him. Food tastes wrong. The world has gone gray and nothing looks the way it used to. The show frames this as a kind of condition, a medical metaphor. But it is transparently, obviously, just clinical depression dressed up as a South Park joke. Stan has become clinically unable to enjoy anything. His parents begin to separate. His friends start drifting away. His relationship with Kyle, his best friend, starts to feel like an obligation they're both performing out of habit rather than actual affection, and the show commits to it. For a full episode, South Park, which usually resets everything back to 0 by the credits, sits with Stan's unhappiness, lets it breathe, lets it be sad. At the time, a lot of viewers and critics noticed that this episode felt unusually personal. The show had been on for 14 years by that point, and there was a real question in the air about whether Parker and Stone had simply run out of road. Whether the show had become, for them, what everything had become for Stan, something they had to keep doing rather than something they genuinely wanted to do. You're Getting Old read to a lot of people like a goodbye letter that Parker couldn't quite bring himself to finish. The show came back, of course, and Stan came back with it. The follow-up episode, Asperger's, immediately following, technically resolves the arc by having Stan start secretly adding alcohol to his food to tolerate the gray, fart noise world, which is, if you take it at face value, a fairly bleak resolution. He doesn't recover, he finds a workaround, he struggles to manage. I find that more honest than a neat fix would have been, actually. It says something true about how depression sometimes works in real life. Not cured, just managed, the edges softened enough to keep going. And the show did keep going. Parker and Stone found new things to be interested in. The Randy era of the show revitalized the whole thing. But Stan's arc in those 2 episodes has always stayed with me as one of the more quietly courageous things the show attempted. It used its most personal character to say something genuinely personal through the medium of fart sounds. That's very South Park. There's a version of Stan that people don't really talk about, which is that he's actually the loneliest of the 4 boys. Kenny has his own kind of loneliness, which we'll get to in a bit, and that's its own thing entirely. But Stan's loneliness is a different flavor. He's surrounded by people. He has a best friend. He has a girlfriend for much of the show. He has parents, even if those parents are constantly in the middle of some kind of domestic drama. He is, by the show's standards, well connected. But Stan is the one who notices when things are wrong. He's the one who says, "This is stupid," when everyone else is swept up in whatever the collective madness of the week happens to be. He's right, consistently and boringly, and nobody listens. And then the episode resets, and next week he has to do it again. If you were being uncharitable, you'd call that the definition of futility. If you were being charitable, you'd call it the definition of integrity. The show, I think, is somewhere in between about it. It admires Stan's compass and finds it slightly exhausting in equal measure, which, again, very Trey Parker. But now, let's talk about the character who exists at the opposite end of the moral spectrum from Stan. The one who is not, by any reasonable definition, decent, and who somehow remains one of the most compelling figures on television. There's a reason people have been writing think pieces about Eric Cartman for 25 years. He's not the kind of villain you find in most animated shows. He's not grand or theatrical. He doesn't want to take over the world. His goals are almost always embarrassingly small. He wants to win an argument. He wants a toy he doesn't have. He wants the last word, and yet the lengths he goes to in pursuit of those small goals are so wildly disproportionate that they loop back around into something genuinely alarming. He's selfish and manipulative and says terrible things with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never once considered that he might be wrong. He has been called by actual television critics in actual publications one of the best written villains in television history. And he's somehow, simultaneously, one of the most beloved characters the show has ever produced. How does that work? I've thought about this quite a lot, and I think it comes down to something specific. Cartman is written with more psychological consistency than most live-action antagonists. His logic, as warped as it is, actually holds together. He wants things. He figures out how to get them. He is rarely stupid in the ways he's strategic, even when the strategy itself is monstrous. And the show never fully lets you forget that underneath all of the scheming, there is a child. A genuinely strange, possibly deeply damaged child, but a child nonetheless. His mother, Leanne Cartman. She's been one of the show's most interesting recurring figures since the very first season. She gives Cartman everything he wants, absorbs every tantrum, and refuses to set limits of any kind. She's been described as the ultimate enabler, but the show has always been a bit more complicated about her than that reading suggests. She loves Cartman with what reads as a genuine, bewildering, bottomless love. Whether that love has done him any good is a different question, but it's real. The mystery of Cartman's father ran for several seasons. The show dangled it, teased it, and eventually paid it off. Not in a dramatic reveal, but in a way that recontextualized things the show had already done. The relevant episode is Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5. And I want to talk about it properly because it's one of the most remarkable things South Park ever produced. And it's where Cartman's character stopped being a simple caricature and became something genuinely interesting. A slightly older boy named Scott Tenorman sells Cartman something for a large sum of money. And Cartman spends the episode trying to get revenge. The revenge plot is complicated, multi-stage, and takes months to execute. It ends with Scott Tenorman discovering, at a chili cook-off, that the chili he has just eaten contained his own parents, who died earlier in the episode as a consequence of Cartman's plotting. And then, as Scott is breaking down in tears, Cartman calls Radiohead to come and watch. He arranged for the band to appear just to witness Scott's humiliation. And Cartman tastes Scott's tears. That's the episode. It's deeply, genuinely dark. Not dark in the way South Park is usually dark, which is to say, loud and theatrical and winking at the audience. This is something quieter and stranger. Cartman is 10. He planned all of this. He executed it perfectly. He felt no remorse. The kicker comes seasons later. It's revealed that Scott Tenorman's father, Jack Tenorman, was also Cartman's biological father, which means that the man Cartman had killed and ground into chili was his own dad, and that he fed his half-brother their shared father. Whether Cartman knew this when he set the plan in motion is deliberately left ambiguous. The show never fully confirms it either way, which is honestly the right call. If he didn't know, the episode is a tragedy with a dark irony at its center. If he did know, and the cold efficiency of how he executed everything suggests he might have, then it's something else entirely. I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I think that's the point. There's a theory among fans, unconfirmed, never denied, that involves an episode where Cartman receives one of Kenny's eyes in a corneal transplant. The theory suggests that this gave Cartman occasional partial flashes of Kenny's perspective. Not full awareness, not complete understanding, but enough that he sometimes seems to almost remember things he couldn't possibly remember. There are moments across several seasons where Cartman says something that seems oddly close to the truth about Kenny's situation, and then moves on as if the thought passed through him and left no trace. Is this confirmed? No. Has it been denied? Also no. And it fits, which is what makes it interesting. But here's what I think is the most underrated thing about Cartman as a character, and it's something the show does very quietly over the years. He has genuine emotional moments, not many, and the show never lets them fully land before pulling back into something ugly, but they're there. His relationship with his mother has real warmth in it, even under all the dysfunction. There are moments, brief, quickly reversed, where Cartman seems to almost recognize what he's doing to people and feel something about it. His relationship with Heidi Turner in the later seasons, which started as a manipulation and then became something messier and less controlled, is probably the most complicated emotional arc he's ever been given. At some point in that arc, the show suggests that Cartman may have actually had feelings for her, proper feelings, and then he destroyed it anyway. Because that's what he does. The tragedy of Cartman, if you're feeling generous, is that he seems to be the only character in the show who is genuinely capable of becoming something better than he is, and who consistently, actively chooses not to. Not because he doesn't know any better, because he's decided that being good at getting what he wants is more satisfying than being good at being good. Whether that's true or not, it makes him fascinating to watch. After all this time, that's no small thing. Since we're on the topic of the boys and of characters who are more complicated than they look, let me talk about the one who carries the show's strangest mythology. The one who was treated as a running joke for years before the show quietly, carefully revealed that something genuinely haunting had been happening all along. Kenny McCormick looks, on paper, like the simplest character in South Park. He's the poor kid. He wears an orange parka with the hood pulled so tight that you can barely see his face and can rarely understand what he says. He lives in a small, worn-down house in what the show presents as the rougher end of South Park. His parents drink too much and fight too much and pay too little attention to anything happening around them. He is, by most measures, the least privileged of the four boys, and the show has always known that, and has always used it. For the first several seasons, Kenny's defining characteristic was that he died. A lot, every episode more or less, some new, usually inventive way. And then every episode he'd be back. Stan would say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." Kyle would say, "You bastards." And then next episode, Kenny was just there again, alive, fine. In early seasons, characters almost never mentioned Kenny's return. For years, this was treated as exactly what it looked like, a running gag. The show never explained it. Almost nobody in the show questioned it. It was just part of the fabric of the thing, like Cartman being selfish or Randy doing something catastrophically embarrassing. Kenny dies. That's his bit. And then, starting around season 13 and continuing into season 14, something changed. Not loudly, not with fanfare, quietly. The way the best reveals in long-running shows tend to happen. The Coon and Friends trilogy. The boys form a superhero team. They all have costumes and made-up powers and names that are clearly just them playing pretend. All of them except one. Kenny's superhero name is Mysterion. And unlike the other boys, who are clearly just kids in costumes, Kenny takes the whole thing with a dead seriousness that doesn't fit the tone of the game everyone else is playing. There's a reason for that. Mysterion's power is that he cannot die. This isn't a bit. This isn't Kenny being dramatic within the fiction of the superhero game. During these episodes, Kenny, as Mysterion, stands in front of his friends and tells them plainly and directly, he cannot die. He has been killed many times over. He always comes back. And nobody ever remembers that it happened. Most of his friends never remember it happening. They think he's exaggerating or making it up or playing a different game than they are. So Kenny, standing right there in front of all of them, proves it. He demonstrates his so-called power the only way he can by dying in front of them. Everyone is horrified. They're crying and screaming and can't process what just happened. And then the next morning, Kenny wakes up in his bed, alive, completely fine. He goes to school, he sees his friends, and not one of them remembers. The whole thing is gone, like it never happened. The emotional weight of this lands in a way that's genuinely unusual for a show that built its entire reputation on irreverence. Here is a child who has been experiencing death and rebirth over and over and over for his entire conscious life. He always wakes up, he never gets to stay gone, and the worst part, the genuinely haunting part, is that nobody knows. Nobody remembers. Every single time he suffers alone, he comes back alone. He can't share it with anyone because there is nothing to share. The people who witnessed it are gone by morning. The show goes further. It actually explains in these episodes where Kenny's condition comes from. Kenny goes home and confronts his parents about a group called the Cult of Cthulhu, a reference, if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, to the ancient cosmic entity at the center of a whole tradition of horror fiction. His parents confirm it. Yes, they attended meetings. They were part of this cult for a time. And the reason they joined? Free beer. That's it. Kenny's parents bound their son into this endless cycle of death and resurrection, this Lovecraftian nightmare with no exit, because there was complimentary beer at the meetings. Which is honestly the most South Park explanation for cosmic horror imaginable. I don't know whether to find it funny or sad, and I think that's exactly the point. There's a moment at the end of the trilogy, the closing minutes of Coon vs. Coon and Friends, that I've thought about many times since I first watched it. Kenny has died again. He's come back again. Nobody remembers again. He tells his friends he's tired and wants to go to bed. The scene cuts to Kenny's house. His mother jolts awake, clutching her stomach, crying out in pain. She screams the words, "It's happening again." And then the next shot is her placing a newborn baby, dressed in a tiny orange parka, into a crib. She turns to her husband and says, with what sounds very much like genuine regret, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting. That line recontextualizes everything. Every death in the early seasons, every ridiculous throwaway played for laughs death suddenly has something underneath it. Kenny has always known, he has always been alone in knowing. The gag was always a tragedy that the audience was laughing at without realizing, and the show went further still in how it handled the deaths going forward. Kenny's deaths shifted significantly in later seasons compared to the early ones. In seasons 1 through 5, they happened constantly, almost every episode. But as the series went on, Kenny's deaths became rarer and heavier. Once the show had established that his situation was genuinely dark, that there was real mythology and real suffering behind the running joke, it couldn't just go back to playing it purely for laughs. The joke had become something else. The show understood that, and it shifted accordingly. In a strange way, Kenny might be the most important character in South Park. Not because he drives the most plots or gets the most screen time, because he's the one who knows what's really going on. He's the one who has been behind the curtain more times than anyone can count. And he comes back every time, and he cannot tell anyone. That's not a gag. That's a portrait of a very particular kind of loneliness. The most South Park thing about all of it, though, the thing that keeps it from being just relentlessly bleak, is the reason the curse exists. Kenny's parents went to a cult meeting for free beer. That is the foundation of the whole mythology. The cosmic horror has the most mundane, domestic, utterly human origin imaginable. Whether that makes it more or less sad, I honestly can't decide. Since we're talking about characters carrying things they can't put down, let's move to Kyle, who carries something different, not a curse, more like a conviction. Kyle Broflovsky is South Park's moral compass, which sounds like a compliment and is, but it also carries a particular kind of exhaustion with it. Being the moral compass of South Park means being correct, consistently, and often loudly, while the entire town ignores you, acts on whatever insane collective impulse has gripped them this week, makes things dramatically worse, and then forgets about the whole thing by Thursday. He's been doing this for the full run of the show. Kyle is Jewish. He's smart. He has a temper that he deploys less strategically than Cartman, but with more emotional honesty. And he tends to be the one who eventually says the true thing that the episode has been building toward. He and Cartman have a friction that is absolutely central to the show's DNA, not quite a rivalry, not quite a friendship, something stranger and more personal than either. Kyle doesn't hate Cartman the way you hate a stranger. He hates him the way you hate someone you know too well and simply cannot get away from. Like Stan is to Trey Parker, Kyle is to Matt Stone. The parallel is fairly direct. Stone is Jewish, he grew up in Colorado. His real-life creative relationship with Parker has some of the same push-and-pull energy as the Kyle-Stan friendship. One of them more instinctively cautious and ethical, the other more willing to push into uncomfortable territory. Kyle is Stone's stand-in the same way Stan is Parker's. And that gives Kyle's moral frustrations a certain authenticity. They don't feel performed. They feel like something Stone actually knows. There's a character detail about Kyle that I think a lot of people overlook, which is his relationship with his adopted younger brother Ike. Ike is Canadian. He was adopted from a family in Canada when he was very young. And Kyle only learns this in elementary school and briefly rejects it before ultimately not caring about it in the slightest. Ike is his brother, full stop. But there are episodes that explore what it means for Kyle to have a sibling who isn't biologically related to him. And those episodes tend to be the ones where Kyle is at his most human. His love for Ike is one of the most unconditional things in a show that is usually very conditional about everything. Kyle will do extraordinary, exhausting things for Ike that he would never do for his own comfort or convenience. There was an entire episode dedicated to Kyle traveling to Canada to get Ike back from his biological parents, which turned into a whole adventure involving Canadian politics and a villain who turned out to be Saddam Hussein, as these things do. But underneath all of that, the episode is just about a kid who loves his little brother and would go unreasonable distances to keep him safe. That's a fun detail, I think, about a character who usually gets to be the responsible one. Kyle's relationship with Cartman is worth staying with for a minute, because it's genuinely one of the more interesting, long-running character dynamics in animation. They are uneasy friends at best. They are clear about this, but they also cannot seem to leave each other alone. Cartman targets Kyle specifically, and Kyle responds to Cartman specifically in a way that suggests they are more significant to each other than either of them would ever admit. The theory you hear from fans sometimes is that Cartman is the only person in South Park who takes Kyle seriously, not in a kind way, but in the sense that Cartman recognizes Kyle as the one person who can actually see through what he's doing and push back on it effectively. Everyone else in South Park is eventually manipulated or confused or simply outlasted. Kyle fights back. Cartman, on some level, seems to find this interesting rather than inconvenient. Whether that's a real dynamic or a retrospective reading, it's at least consistent with everything the show has accumulated across its run. The burden that Kyle carries, though, the thing that actually characterizes his experience across the show's run, is the burden of being right in a world that doesn't reward rightness. He struggles to keep up with the Chimpokemon craze in Season 3. He argues against the social media spiral in Season 18. He argues against internet comment culture, against groupthink, against mob mentality, against any number of things that the show uses as weekly targets. And he is right about all of them, and South Park doesn't care. And then next week, something else happens and he has to start again. There's something very real about that, actually, underneath all the crude jokes. The experience of being the person who sees something clearly and cannot make anyone else see it. The exhaustion of being correct in a room that isn't listening. Kyle keeps arguing anyway. Every season, every episode, he keeps trying. I find that oddly quite moving. But now let's lighten the mood a little, or at least shift it, because the character I want to talk about next is not especially dark considered against the others, but he might be the most quietly sad character on the show, and also somehow the funniest. Butterscotch was not supposed to be a main character. He appears in the very first episode of South Park briefly as a background kid, a blonde boy with a round face and a slightly anxious expression who is just sort of there, in the crowd, not doing anything particular. For the first couple of seasons, that's all he was. Furniture with a face. And then Kenny was killed off, not in the usual way. In Season 5, Kenny dies, an episode that treated the running gag as just once, something real and sad. Kenny was given a terminal diagnosis and died properly. The boys grieved. Not for long, and not without the show gently mocking the grief as it went. But still, they grieved, and for a stretch of Season 6, they needed a new fourth friend to fill the gap. They held a competition which became its own episode, a Bachelor parody where the boys chose a new best friend from a field of candidates. The winner was Butters. And in the process of making him a main character, the writers discovered something. Butters is extraordinary. He is sunny and guileless and infuriating in the way that very genuinely kind people are sometimes infuriating. He takes everything at face value. He apologizes for things that aren't his fault. He tries to understand people who treat him terribly. He has an almost preternatural capacity for forgiveness that the show seems genuinely unable to undermine no matter how hard it tries. And the show tries very hard. His parents, Christopher and Linda Stotch, are, across the full run of the show, probably the most consistently awful parents in a program that has a great many awful parents to choose from. They ground Butters with a frequency and enthusiasm that borders on enthusiastic. They ground him for things that were not his fault. They ground him for things that were actively done to him. There's an episode where Butters is grounded while his parents are away for the weekend, and he rings them at their hotel to ask if he can come out of his room yet, and they say no, and he accepts this with complete docility. In another episode, and I want to be careful here because this one is genuinely dark, his mother made a terrible mistake and blamed Butters for it to avoid admitting what had happened, And Butters' response when this finally comes out is not rage or devastation. It's a kind of sad, careful attempt to understand, to find a way to not hold it against her. There is something in Butters' character that the show keeps circling around and never quite names directly, which is the idea that this level of unfailing kindness in a person who has been treated this badly for this long is not naivety, it's survival. Butters has found that staying cheerful, staying forgiving, staying open is the only way to get through a childhood that would have hollowed out most people. It's not innocence, it's a very conscious, very hard-won choice. And then there's Professor Chaos. When the boys fired Butters as their friend in season 6, actually fired him, sat him down and told him he wasn't up to standard, Butters went home and cried for a while and then decided to turn evil. He constructed a supervillain costume out of aluminium foil. He made himself a cape. He named himself Professor Chaos, bringer of destruction and doom. He vowed to wreak havoc upon the unsuspecting populace of South Park. His first act of chaos, he went to a restaurant and swapped 2 soup orders. His second act, he stole a classroom eraser and buried it in his garden. He also, at some point, tried to flood the world by running a garden hose into a paddling pool. He stood back and watched the paddling pool fill up very slowly. He declared it a start. The gap between the grandiosity of Professor Chaos, the foil helmet, the cape, the evil laughter, and the actual scale of his villainy is one of the funniest and most genuinely endearing things the show has ever done. He is trying so hard to be something he is constitutionally incapable of being. He cannot actually hurt anyone. It's not in him. So Professor Chaos swaps soup orders and calls it the first step toward dominion. Here's the thing about Professor Chaos, though. The character isn't just a joke at Butters' expense. It's also a portrait of what it looks like when someone who has been repeatedly treated as insignificant decides, quietly and in their own private way, that they matter. Professor Chaos is Butters insisting, in the only register available to him, that he exists, that he can affect things, that he is not just furniture. He can't pull it off. He's too soft, too fundamentally decent. But I think he keeps trying. There's a fan theory, not confirmed, not denied, just sort of out there in the long conversation that fans have been having about this show for 20 years. That Butters is the character on South Park who is most aware of how strange his life is, and who has chosen not to mention it to anyone because pointing it out would require him to feel it fully. He keeps smiling. He keeps forgiving. He keeps going, whether that's a deliberate writing choice or something the character developed on his own over hundreds of episodes. I genuinely can't say. But it feels true. It feels like something real about a certain kind of person. Butters is, in a lot of ways, the heart of South Park. Not the loud, chaotic heart of it, not Cartman's scheming, or Kenny's mythology, or Randy's spectacular failures. The quiet heart. The part of the show that, underneath everything, still believes in the basic decency of people, even when the evidence is, honestly, not great. And talking about adults who believe in their own projects against all available evidence, let's talk about Randy Marsh, who started as a minor character and somehow, over 20-something seasons, became the unexpected soul of the whole show. Randy Marsh was not supposed to be interesting. In the earliest seasons of South Park, he was Stan's dad. That was his whole function. He was a geologist who lived in a suburban house and had a slightly fraught marriage and occasionally did something foolish to embarrass his son. He was furniture with a speaking part. You could have replaced him with any generic sitcom dad and the show would have been unchanged. And then slowly something happened. Randy started getting more episodes, more screen time, more material. The show discovered that Trey Parker had a genuine affinity for writing Randy, that the character gave him room to do something a little different from the boy-centered satire that had defined the early seasons. Randy wasn't bound by the moral framework the boys operated in. He was an adult, which in South Park means he had no constraints at all and no self-awareness to speak of. The Wheel of Fortune episode in season 11, where Randy guesses a racial slur as the answer to a puzzle and has to navigate the consequences, was a turning point. Not because it was the best Randy episode, it isn't, but because it established that Randy could carry an episode on his own, could be the focus rather than the background, and could be genuinely funny without needing the boys at all. After that, the Randy episodes kept coming. The Losing Edge, where he starts getting into brawls with other fathers at Little League games specifically to avoid watching Stan play baseball, and gets increasingly committed to it. His food addiction episodes, his celebrity chef phase, his Lord phase, which is a thing that happened and which remains one of the stranger creative decisions the show has ever made. But the real shift came in seasons 22 and 23. Randy moves the entire Marsh family away from their South Park suburb to a marijuana farm. He calls it Tegrity Farms. He insists with great conviction that this is the family's dream, that this is integrity, that this is the right path forward. He begins making artisanal cannabis products with a fervor that is quite something to witness. His family is miserable. Sharon is exhausted. Stan is embarrassed. Shelley, who already had very little patience for her father on the best of days, has even less now. They live on a farm in the middle of nothing, far from their friends, in service of Randy's conviction that this is what they all wanted. When Sharon points out that she never wanted any of this, Randy is genuinely surprised. He didn't realize anyone had other feelings. It simply hadn't occurred to him. That's the thing about Randy that makes him such a fascinating character. He's not selfish in the calculating way Cartman is selfish. He doesn't scheme. He genuinely believes in whatever he's currently doing. He has a sincere, undimmed conviction of a man who has never successfully completed a self-examination. Every new phase of Randy's life is the real Randy, the true Randy, the best version of Randy. And then the phase ends and the new phase begins with exactly the same level of complete sincerity. The Tegrity Farms era, which runs from season 22 right through the most recent seasons, turned Randy into the show's de facto protagonist. More episodes centered on him than on any of the boys. He started feuds with neighboring weed farms. He had conflicts with his immigrant employees. He tried to take the business global. He took microdoses of ketamine with his friend Towley and then had to explain this to his family. He called a business meeting while wearing a flannel shirt and no shoes. There's a reading of Randy Marsh, and I think it's the right one, that he's Trey Parker satirizing his own generation. The baby boomers and the older edge of Generation X who hit a certain age and developed an intense need to reinvent themselves, to find their authentic self, to start over as someone more interesting than the person they'd been for 40 years. The passion project that takes precedence over everything else. The farm, the business, the brand. The insistence that the family must share the dream. Randy does all of this at enormous cost to everyone around him. And he never quite notices. But here's the thing about Randy that the show has always protected, even as it satirizes him. He's not cruel. He's not trying to hurt anyone. He loves his wife and his kids in the genuine, inarticulate, seldom demonstrated way that a certain kind of man loves his family. When things go wrong, when the farm fails, when Sharon is at the end of her tether, when Stan looks at him with the specific disappointment of a child who expected more, Randy feels it. He doesn't always respond well, but he feels it. He's the funniest character on the show at this point, I think. And he might also be the most honest portrait of middle-aged, man-shaped restlessness that television has produced, which is an odd thing to say about a cartoon where he once got into a fistfight with his neighbor over a marijuana brand's St. Patrick's Day special. But there it is. Since we're talking about characters who left the show differently than they arrived, let me talk about Chef, who was there from the very beginning and whose exit from South Park was genuinely one of the stranger things to happen in the show's long history. Chef was there from the beginning. Jerome McElroy, school cafeteria cook at South Park Elementary. A warm, enormous man who cooked the food, gave the boys advice and sang them songs that were almost always wildly inappropriate for children, but delivered with such complete sincerity that you couldn't quite object. He had a voice that could have been on any Stax Records release from 1968, and he used it to explain adult situations to fourth graders in the most oblique possible ways. He was the one adult in South Park who was consistently, reliably, actually on the kids' side. Not the exasperated but well-meaning side. Not the distracted but essentially okay side, genuinely, actively on their side. He liked them. He was interested in their problems. He treated their concerns as real concerns rather than the fussiness of children. Chef was the warmth. The voice behind Chef was Isaac Hayes. If that name isn't immediately familiar, Isaac Hayes was a musician of genuine, serious importance. He wrote the theme from Shaft. He was one of the foundational architects of the Memphis soul sound. He won an Academy Award for that theme in 1972 and became one of the most recognizable voices in American popular music. He had been the voice of Chef since season 1, and the chemistry was extraordinary. Whatever Hayes brought to the character, the naturalness, the warmth, the willingness to play a man who sang love songs to elementary school children about entirely unsuitable subjects, made Chef feel real in a way that very few South Park characters do. He left the show in early 2006. Hayes' departure came after the season 9 episode Trapped in the Closet, which was South Park's extended satirical takedown of Scientology. Hayes is a member of the Church of Scientology. He cited the episode as a religious attack that he couldn't support. He described it as crossing a line. Trey Parker and Matt Stone's response was, as you might expect, not especially diplomatic. They pointed out publicly, directly, that South Park had spent 9 seasons making fun of virtually every religion on Earth. Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, Mormonism, Hinduism, and several more all had their episodes. Hayes had not previously objected to any of them. His objection arose at the precise moment when his own religion became the target. Parker and Stone noted this. They noted it fairly loudly. Whether you sympathize more with Hayes' position, that there's a difference between satirizing a faith and satirizing your specific faith, or with Parker and Stone's position, that consistent satire shouldn't have a carve-out for anyone's personal convictions, probably depends on what you already believe about those kinds of things. I find both positions understandable. I also find the whole episode genuinely sad, because what ended in a public dispute was a creative partnership that had produced 9 seasons of something genuinely special. The show killed Chef. The return of Chef. The first episode of season 10 explains that Chef has been brainwashed by a cult called the Super Adventure Club and has become someone the boys no longer recognize. It is, if you watch it with full knowledge of the context, fairly pointed about its position on what had happened. The boys try to save their friend. They can't. Chef dies in an elaborate, over-the-top sequence. And here's the detail that I always find fascinating about this episode. The producers had to build Chef's dialogue entirely out of spliced recordings from previous seasons. Every line Hayes speaks in the episode is assembled from fragments of old lines, edited together to form new sentences. If you watch it knowing this, you can hear the joins. The rhythm is slightly off. The pauses are in strange places. The voice is Hayes, but the voice is also not quite Hayes. It's pieces of him reassembled. Kyle's eulogy for Chef is one of the most oddly moving things the show has ever produced. He says, in substance, that their friend is gone, and that what they saw wasn't really him, and that they should remember him the way he was, not the way he ended. He separates the performer from the character. He speaks about the person they loved rather than the thing that left. It lands, even knowing all the surrounding context. It lands anyway. Chef's absence left something in the show that was never quite filled. There are characters who are warm in their own ways. Randy occasionally. PEZ Principal in his later seasons. But there's no one who holds Chef's specific position, the adult who is entirely on the children's side, with no agenda, no embarrassment, no drama of his own to work through. That space has been empty since 2006. The show goes on without it, but it's there if you're looking. Since we're on the topic of characters who were always present without anyone fully noticing what they were doing, let me introduce you to Craig Tucker, who has been in the background of this show since nearly the beginning and who has developed in complete silence into one of its most interesting figures. Craig Tucker has one distinguishing feature in his earliest appearances. He flips people off. Not for any particular reason, not in response to anything specific. Craig just flips people off with his middle finger, calmly, without apparent anger, as a sort of default mode of engagement with the world around him. It was a running gag in the early seasons, and it was funny precisely because of how casual it was. No emotion behind it. Just a response, a gesture. This is how Craig interacts with things. Craig wears a blue hat. He has a flat, slightly bored affect. He rarely initiates anything. Things happen around him. He observes them. He does not seem very surprised by most of them. Over the seasons, and this is one of those character developments that happens so slowly you almost miss it, Craig became the unofficial voice of flat, accurate cynicism in a show that is already very cynical. When the other kids are caught up in something, Craig is usually the one who has already worked out how it's going to go wrong. When an adventure begins, Craig tends to already know that it will be unpleasant and will somehow specifically inconvenience him. The Peru episodes are the best illustration of this. Pandemic and Pandemic 2, The Startling from Season 12. A mysterious Peruvian flute band crisis threatens the world. And Craig, for reasons too complicated to get into here, ends up being identified as the key to saving everything, and finds himself at the center of an international emergency in South America entirely against his will. His response to all of it is not heroism, not excitement, not fear, just the flat, continuous, entirely reasonable objection that he did not want to be here, he did not ask to be here, and he would like to go home. He is right about this. He is right about most of it. Nobody listens. He becomes a guinea pig king through no choice or action of his own. He does not find this interesting. There's a fan theory about Craig, never confirmed, not particularly deniable, that he is the one character in South Park who has simply accepted the reality of his situation. Not in a defeated way, in the most realistic way. He understands that insane things happen constantly and without cause and cannot be stopped. He has made peace with this. That's why he's so unflappable. He's not calm because he doesn't understand what's happening. He's calm because he understands perfectly and has decided that distress would be surplus to requirements. Whether that's the writer's intention or something the character grew into over hundreds of episodes, I couldn't say. But it holds. The Craig and Tweak relationship is worth a proper mention here. In Season 19, a running storyline emerged from a cultural exchange program in which a group of Japanese students created fan art depicting Craig and Tweak as a romantic couple. The fan art spread. The town became invested in it. Craig and Tweak spent the bulk of the arc denying and avoiding the whole thing. And then, quietly, without making a particularly big deal of it, they admitted it was real. They were together. This was actual fact now, not fiction. They have been together since Season 19. What I find genuinely interesting about this, and I think about it sometimes, is the pairing itself. Craig, who commits to nothing, who maintains perfect emotional distance from everything, is in a stable and caring relationship with Tweak, who is the most anxious character on the entire show. Tweak runs on caffeine and barely contained panic. His default expression is the expression of someone who has just heard an extremely loud noise in a quiet library. He shakes, he worries, he anticipates disasters. And Craig is steady for him. It's not played as a punchline, the show just lets it be true. Craig, who flips everyone off and has decided that the world is going to be unpleasant regardless of his response, has one person he shows up for consistently and without drama. There's something in that pairing that feels weirdly true to life. Sometimes the most undemonstrative person is the most reliable one. Craig became a fan favorite not because the show gave him a spotlight moment or a defining arc, but because of consistency. He kept showing up, he kept being exactly himself. And over hundreds of episodes, exactly himself turned out to be quite a lot. He also still flips people off, by the way. Some things don't change. And that brings us to the character who arrived in season 19 and immediately demanded everyone's attention in a way Craig never would. PC Principal, who was supposed to be a one-off and accidentally became something more complicated. PC Principal arrived in the first episode of season 19 and immediately fired Mr. Garrison. He's large, he wears a polo shirt. He speaks in the specific cadence of someone who has attended a lot of mandatory diversity training and emerged from it more aggressive than they went in. He beat up Cartman in that first episode. He was clearly there to be a single episode antagonist, a satirical exaggeration of aggressive political correctness, played for 1 week's worth of jokes and then presumably never mentioned again. He's been a main character ever since. What the show discovered fairly quickly, as it turned out, was that PC Principal was not just a target for satire. He was a vehicle for it. He gave the show a way to do something genuinely difficult, which is to simultaneously make fun of a thing and take it seriously. PC Principal does things that are clearly ridiculous. He also frequently points at things that are actually wrong. He's right about some of it. He's unpleasant about all of it. Those two facts coexist, and the show refuses to resolve the tension. That, I think, is why he stayed. A simple parody of political correctness would have been easy and would have dated immediately. But a character who embodies both the legitimate impulse behind progressive culture and its most alienating expressions, who is correct about the thing he's pointing at but disastrous in every method he uses to address it, that character could keep generating material indefinitely. Because that character is recognizable. We've all encountered some version of PC Principal, in a workplace, or in a family, or in a group chat that took a dark turn at some point. His character arc across the following seasons is actually one of the more interesting quiet developments in South Park's recent history. He starts as a figure who exists purely to be satirized. He starts to become more complicated. He becomes entangled with Strong Woman, the school's vice principal, and the relationship they develop is handled with more genuine nuance than most relationships in the show. Strong Woman is his equal. She's not softening him, and she's not defined by him. They're two people with strongly held convictions trying to figure out how to also be regular humans who are in a relationship, and eventually raising children together. The PC babies, their children, become a running storyline in their own right. And while the jokes around them are South Park jokes, loud, sometimes grotesque, the actual parental dynamic between PC Principal and Strong Woman feels like something you could almost believe in. He's also, in later seasons, shown being kind. Not ostentatiously kind, just occasionally decent. He supports students he's worried about. He advocates for the school in ways that seem genuinely motivated rather than performative. He still shouts and still threatens and still takes things 3 steps further than they need to go. But there's something underneath that now. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting to care about PC Principal when he arrived. He seemed like a joke with legs, and jokes with legs usually wear out. But the show did the interesting thing with him rather than the easy thing, and here he still is. There's a version of this character that would have been retired after a season and forgotten. Instead, he's become part of what South Park is, which I think says something about the show's instinct for finding the human thing inside the satirical shell. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes. Since we're on the topic of characters whose names carry more meaning than they first appear to, let me talk about Tolkien Black, whose name has a whole story of its own. For 25 years, the character's name was Token, not a surname, just Token. Token Black. The one black kid in South Park, named explicitly as a reference to the token minority character, the single representative of a group included in an ensemble to satisfy a demographic checkbox. The name was the joke. It was stated clearly, right there on the surface, which is how South Park tends to operate when it's being direct about something. And for a long time, the character held that position in the show's structure. He appeared, he was developed somewhat, he plays bass guitar, his family is notably wealthier than most of South Park's families. He has his own personality and his own presence in episodes. He wasn't just a walking punchline, but his name was. His name was a meta-commentary on the tokenism of his own existence in the show. Then season 25 arrived. The show casually revealed, not with any particular fanfare, just as a matter of course, in the way South Park drops things, that the character's actual name had always been Tolkien, as in J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. His father, it turns out, is a devoted fan. The name was spelled out. Everyone in the show had simply been mishearing it, or misreading it, for 20 plus years. Tolkien was always a commentary on his racial position. He was named after a literary giant. The audience had been filling in the joke where there wasn't one. I find this genuinely clever, and I find it slightly complicated, and I think both of those things are probably the right response. The clever part is obvious. It's a retroactive recontextualization that changes everything that came before, or at least offers a way of reading everything before through a different lens. The joke was never his name. The joke was always that we assumed his name was a racial joke when it was something else entirely. The 25 years of Tolkien wasn't the show being lazy. It was the show setting up a specific kind of misdirection. The complicated part is also obvious. 25 seasons is a long time to sit on that recontextualization. And there are plenty of people who will point out, not unreasonably, that regardless of what it was always really called, the character was introduced into a specific context, with a specific reading, and that context shaped how audiences related to him for the better part of 3 decades. Whether the Tolkien reveal works as redemption or as a clever dodge probably depends on what you already thought of the original joke. I don't think there's a clean verdict available here. Both readings are defensible. The show, I suspect, knew exactly what it was doing and was comfortable with the ambiguity. What I can say with more confidence is that Tolkien, however you feel about the name, is a good character. He's grounded and steady. He has his own opinions. He pushes back when he thinks something is wrong. He and Craig have a friendship that feels like an actual friendship between two people who find each other reliable rather than a friendship formed out of proximity and lack of alternatives. His home life is depicted with more stability than most of South Park's kids, which is itself a character note. He's not running from anything, not managing anything, not compensating for anything. He's just there. The name thing is interesting, but Tolkien Black is interesting beyond it, which might be the quieter point the show was making all along. Let me take a minute now to talk about some of the other secondary kids because a few of them have developed into something worth knowing about quietly over the years. South Park's 4th grade class is enormous. If you've ever watched the show with attention, you'll have noticed that the background of any given classroom scene is dense with children who have consistent designs, consistent clothing, and consistent positions in the crowd. Most of them never speak. A handful of them get an episode or 2 across the full run of the series. And then there are the ones who develop slowly and without much announcement into actual people. Jimmy Valmer is one of those. Jimmy does stand-up comedy. He has a stutter that means his performances take considerably longer than they would otherwise, and he leans into this with complete professionalism. Timing is timing, and Jimmy's timing is, by any honest assessment, excellent. He has genuine material. He is better at this than most of the adults in South Park are at anything they do. Here's the thing about how the show handles Jimmy's disability, which is something I genuinely respect about it. The stutter is never the target of the joke. In a show that makes a point of going after everything, Jimmy's stutter is simply a fact about him. The comedy of Jimmy's stand-up comes from the situation, the timing, the content, not from mockery of the speech impediment itself. He is a comedian who happens to stutter, not a punchline who happens to stand at a microphone. The show also gave Jimmy a fairly dark episode in season 9 called Erection Day, which is exactly what it sounds like, and which involves Jimmy making a series of increasingly inadvisable decisions in service of what he has convinced himself is a logistical problem. The episode is absurd and also oddly compassionate. Jimmy is trying to solve a problem with the available information. The information is bad, his solutions are worse. The episode never mocks him for any of it. Jimmy and Timmy's friendship is one of the show's quieter, ongoing threads. Timmy Birch is the kid in the motorized wheelchair who, in his earliest appearances, could produce only his own name. Timmy. That was it, a single word with infinite variations of emphasis. For the first several episodes featuring Timmy, this seemed like a simple joke, a one-note character who could only say his own name and the comedy of the situations that created. But Timmy kept appearing, and the show kept finding things to do with him. He formed a band, he traveled, he competed in sports. He became part of the show's fabric in a way that went past the initial gag. What happened, I think, is that the writers came to like Timmy without quite planning to, and that affection leaked into the writing. By the time Timmy and Jimmy became friends, two kids with disabilities who found each other and formed a genuine bond, the show had done something it didn't always do. It had developed a character past the joke that created him. Timmy has agency. Within the world of the show, he makes choices. He has preferences. He reacts. He pushes back. The motorized wheelchair is a practical fact of his existence, not a metaphor for limitation. He's just Timmy doing the things Timmy does. Tweak needs his own mention, separate from the Craig discussion, because his character is a portrait of something very specific and very recognized. Anxiety that has been manufactured by the people who are supposed to protect him from it. Tweak's parents run a coffee shop. They have, since he was young, given him enormous quantities of caffeine. Not as neglect, they do care about him in their way, but as a matter of course, as if this is simply what you give children. Tweak is perpetually over-caffeinated, perpetually on the edge of panic, perpetually convinced that something terrible is about to happen. He shakes, he twitches, he speaks at a volume and a pace that suggests a constant low-level emergency. And his parents, when concerns are raised about this, express worry about his anxiety disorder, which they caused, which they keep causing every day by giving him more coffee. The show doesn't say this directly, it doesn't have to. The irony is right there. Tweak is a case study in how parental behavior creates the problems it then claims to be addressing. His anxiety is real. His suffering is real. The origin of it is sitting in the coffee shop, served in a paper cup with a cheerful logo. What South Park does with Tweak that I find interesting is that it never pitches him as purely a comedy figure. Yes, his panic is funny in the way that extreme behavior in a safe context can be funny. But the show lets him be frightened, actually frightened, and doesn't immediately undercut it. His fears are irrational, but his terror is genuine. And his relationship with Craig, the steady one, the reliable one, works as more than a punchline because there's something underneath it. Tweak found the one person in South Park who isn't going to be swept up in the collective anxiety of whatever crisis is happening this week. That's not nothing. Now, the Goth Kids. The Goth Kids have been there since season 7. There are 4 of them, Pete, Michael, Henrietta, and Ferkel. And they wear black and write poetry and smoke cigarettes by the school and take extremely firm positions against conformity. They are South Park's satire of teenage Gothic subculture. And they are funny, and they're also something else. Here's the thing about the Goth Kids. The show never fully mocks them for what they believe. It mocks the performance of it, the cigarettes, the expressionless delivery, the competitive grievance about who is more suffering. But the actual substance of their worldview, that mainstream conformity, deserves critique. That finding something beautiful in darkness is valid. That not fitting in is an acceptable and potentially interesting choice. The show treats this with something approaching respect. They have their own lore. They know things about the mythology of the show that other characters don't. In the Kuhn and Friends trilogy, they appear with the Necronomicon, an actual knowledge about how the cosmic machinery works. They are, within the show's universe, genuinely in contact with something real, not because their aesthetic is correct, but because they've been paying a different kind of attention than everyone else. I like the goth kids quite a lot, actually. They're the kids South Park forgets to satirize properly because the thing they're gesturing at is too real. And then there's Wendy Testaberger, who deserves a mention, if only because her trajectory across the seasons is one of the more interesting quiet stories the show has. She was prominent in the early seasons, Stan's girlfriend, the most academically and politically engaged kid in the class, frequently the one making serious arguments that the show then deflated. She almost disappeared entirely around seasons 5 and 6. Wendy Testaberger became a more prominent character again after seasons 5 and 6. By season 11, she had developed into something more fully realized. She beat up Cartman in one episode, and it remains to many fans one of the most satisfying moments in the show's history. Wendy is, in a lot of ways, what Kyle might look like if Kyle were a girl and had been given the same serious treatment. She is correct about things. She argues clearly and well. The show frequently has her be right and then have her be ignored, which is the South Park fate of anyone with genuine conviction. But she keeps going. Like Kyle, like Stan, like most of the kids who actually care about something. That persistence in a world designed to make caring seem futile might be the most human thing about all of them. Since we've spent a lot of tonight inside the school, let me take us outside of it for a moment. Let me talk about the town itself, because South Park, the place, is as much a character as any of the people who live in it. Herbert Garrison has had more lives than almost any character on South Park. He arrived in season 1 as the boys' teacher, already operating in a space of significant personal denial. He used a puppet, Mr. Hat, as a way of voicing opinions he didn't want to claim directly. He was in the closet about his sexuality in a way the show made increasingly difficult to ignore. He was cruel to his students in the specific, petty way that people who are unhappy in their own lives are sometimes cruel to the people around them. He was funny, he was unsettling, he was very South Park. The Mr. Hat dynamic is worth sitting with for a moment, actually. A teacher using a hand puppet to say things he didn't personally want to own. Bigoted remarks, inappropriate comments, opinions that technically came from the puppet rather than from Mr. Garrison himself, is a portrait of a very specific kind of cowardice. The person who says, "I'm not saying this, but," and then says it, routing everything through a ventriloquist dummy so they can technically disclaim it. Mr. Hat was Garrison's plausible deniability, except everyone could see his hand inside the puppet, which is, in its own quiet way, a fairly accurate observation about how that kind of thing works in real life too. Over the seasons, Garrison went through more character transformations than anyone else on the show. He came out. He became a woman for a stretch, then changed back. He had relationships. He lost his job. He got another job. He became a political figure, first a congressional candidate, then a president, operating explicitly as a caricature of Donald Trump from season 19 onward. That last transformation is the one that stayed. For several seasons, South Park ran a plotline where Mr. Garrison, now Garrison, just Garrison, was President of the United States. He campaigned by saying things no actual candidate would say. He was elected by a population that found his honesty, however grotesque, refreshing. He then spent several seasons being an absolutely disastrous president who was surprised by this, despite having never given any indication he wanted to govern. Here's the thing about Garrison. As the Trump analog, and I think about this sometimes, the show made a choice not to import Trump wholesale. They used an existing character and gave him the Trump storyline. This meant that Garrison brought decades of existing characterization with him. He was not purely a political symbol. He was also the man who had been complicated and messy and human for 20-plus seasons before any of this. He was sad and funny and occasionally sympathetic in ways that a pure caricature wouldn't have been. Whether that made the satire sharper or muddier probably depends on what you wanted from it. The show has never been entirely sure what it wants to say about Trump, or maybe it's always been sure, but that thing is genuinely complicated, and simple verdict satire isn't what South Park has ever been best at. Garrison as Trump is a portrait of how political authority gets seized by people who didn't expect to seize it, and who then don't know what to do with it. That's interesting. It doesn't resolve neatly. South Park is fine with that. And through all of it, the gender transitions, the presidential arc, the puppet, the teaching, the everything, there's a consistency to Garrison that the show has always maintained. He is someone who has spent his entire adult life running from things about himself and finding that the things he's running from keep arriving before he does. He never quite achieves peace. He's always in the middle of something. He is, in his own very specific way, trying. That's not nothing. South Park, Colorado is a real place. It's a high-altitude valley in the central part of the state, sitting between mountain ranges, flat and wide and exposed. The town in the show is not the town in reality. The real South Park is more of a high mountain basin of scattered ranching communities, alongside small towns like Fairplay that have a school and a shopping district. But Trey Parker grew up in Colorado, and the landscape informs everything about the aesthetic of the show. That openness, that particular quality of sky that you only get at altitude. The way snow covers everything, and the mountains just stand there behind it, patient and uninterested. The fictional South Park is, by most normal metrics, not a desirable place to live. The adults make catastrophically bad collective decisions at a pace that would exhaust a full-time observer. They form mobs, they follow whoever seems most confident regardless of whether that person has any idea what they're talking about. They adopt new beliefs with total conviction and abandon them equally completely in the next episode or the next week when the new crisis arrives. They are, as a community, incapable of learning from anything. This cycle, panic, mob, misplaced authority, disaster, reset, runs across every season of the show. The specific targets change. The internet, celebrity culture, political correctness, social media, streaming services, AI, vaccines, whatever happened in the news last Tuesday. The mechanism stays the same. The adults of South Park go through the same cycle with every new topic, every single time, and come out the other side exactly where they started. In a different show, this would be depressing. In South Park, it's the engine that makes everything run, because the cycle's very predictability is the point. The show is not saying, look at this terrible thing that happened. It's saying, look at this pattern which you recognize, which is happening again, which will happen again after this. The geography of the town matters more than it might seem. The bus stop, obviously, that's the fixed point everything returns to, but also the layout. Kenny's house is on the rough side of town, small, slightly worn, always slightly cold-looking. Cartman's house is comfortable and tidy and warm, with a mother who genuinely tries to make it a good home regardless of what it costs her. Kyle's house is solid and well-ordered. Stan's house is unremarkable in the specific way of a house where normal things are supposed to happen. You can read the class dynamics of South Park just from its architecture. Kenny's family is struggling, Cartman's family is comfortable, but there's only Leanne. Tolkien's family is the wealthiest in the show. Their house is noticeably larger than everyone else's. These are not accidental choices. The show is aware of them. And then there's the Krusty Krab. Sorry, the Krusty Krab is something else. There are the institutions of South Park, the school, City Hall, the Bijou Cinema, the various shops and restaurants and landmarks that function as recurring backdrops. Skeeter's Bar, Tom's Rhinoplasty, the Casu Bonito restaurant, which is a real place in Denver that Cartman considered worth an elaborate scheme to gain access to. The recurring authority figures of the town deserve a quick mention. Mayor McDaniels, who has been the mayor since the beginning and has survived every catastrophe, every political crisis, every alien invasion, and supernatural event, with her position somehow intact. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor whose McKay verbal tick has become one of the show's most enduring sound signatures. Officer Barb Brady, the deeply useless local policeman who was eventually replaced by slightly different, deeply useless policemen. These figures create the architecture of authority that the show dismantles every week. They're the institutions, they're the framework that is supposed to prevent the chaos and consistently either enables it or causes it directly. And here's the thing about South Park as a town, it always resets. Whatever happened, alien invasion, zombie outbreak, Cthulhu, presidential disaster, pandemic, by the next episode or the next season, South Park is more or less back to baseline. The boys are still there, the snow is still falling. They've always got something to talk about. That reset is the show's most honest structural statement. It is not saying that things get better. It is saying that things keep going. The town survives everything it goes through not because it learns or adapts or grows wiser, but because that's just what towns do. They persist. The people in them persist. Life keeps happening in spite of everything. There's a comfort in that, I think. Something that accounts in part for why people keep returning to South Park even when individual episodes are difficult or uncomfortable or make them feel like they should probably be doing something more productive with their evening. Let me take a breath now before we wind down. Let me talk briefly about what Trey Parker and Matt Stone actually built and why that building is still standing. There's something worth saying about the two people who made all of this. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been running South Park together since the very beginning. Not in the way that a showrunner runs a television series, handing off duties, delegating seasons, working through a writing staff of 40 people. They have written and directed the vast majority of the show personally. Parker has written credit on over 300 episodes. He has directed over 300 episodes. They have, between them, produced more hours of television with this level of authorial control than almost anyone in television history. The way the show is produced is famously unlike anything else in the industry. Each episode is written, animated, voiced, and delivered in roughly 6 days. The show is still broadcast on a Wednesday, and the episode that airs on that Wednesday was typically a blank document on the previous Thursday. 6 days from nothing to broadcast. This is an extraordinary way to make television. It means the show can respond to something that happened last Tuesday, which is why South Park has always had this quality of feeling immediate. Like it was made by people who were watching the same news you were watching. Because it was. Because they were. It also means the show has a quality that most long-running series lose. Urgency. There is no time to overthink things at South Park. There is no committee. There is a rapid 6-day development process. Parker or Stone has an idea on Thursday, and by Wednesday it's on television, and the quality of the idea is the quality of the idea. It hasn't been smoothed by development or complicated by compromise. Sometimes that produces something tremendous. Sometimes it produces something that doesn't quite work, but it always produces something that feels alive. The two of them have also been remarkably honest about what they find funny and what they find interesting across the full run of the series. The show has changed their minds publicly, in real time. The early seasons have a different character from the middle seasons, and the middle seasons from the recent ones. You can watch the show's priorities shift. You can watch Parker get more interested in Randy. You can watch Stone's influence and the moral seriousness that keeps sneaking back in under the crude jokes. You can watch both of them wrestle episode by episode with a world that keeps changing faster than satire can process it. There's a version of this show that became comfortable in its 3rd or 4th season and stayed there. Many long-running series do this. They find their groove and they stay in it, and the groove calcifies, and eventually the show is technically still alive but not really breathing. South Park has not done this. Not because every season is better than the last, that would be impossible over a run this long, but because Parker and Stone keep genuinely trying to figure out what they think about new things. They keep being confused by the world and trying to make something out of the confusion. That seems worth saying before we start to wind down. The show exists because two specific people have been committed to it for 3 decades in a way that is unusual and somewhat unfashionable in an industry that tends to treat authorship as a team sport. South Park is what it is because it's their thing, made in the specific way they want to make it, about the specific things they want to think about, in the specific voice they've developed across hundreds of episodes and hundreds of hours. Whatever you think of the specific jokes, and the specific jokes are often extremely provocative, frequently intentionally offensive, occasionally genuinely difficult, the show is an act of sustained personal expression made by real people who care about what they're making. That's rarer than it should be, right? I think we're getting close to the end of the evening. There's a version of the conversation about South Park that focuses entirely on the male characters, the 4 boys, their fathers, the adult men, and treats the female characters as supporting architecture, which is honestly how a lot of people have watched the show. And it's not entirely unfair. South Park has always been primarily interested in its male characters, especially the boys. But that framing misses some things. A handful of the women in this show are genuinely interesting and have done genuinely interesting things across the run of the series, and they deserve a mention. Wendy Testerberger has been there since season 1. She stands on-again, off-again girlfriend, the most politically engaged student in 4th grade, the one who brings serious arguments into situations that resist taking anything seriously. She was prominent early, faded significantly in the middle seasons. There was a stretch where she barely appeared at all, and then re-emerged in later seasons with more to do. The episode most people remember when it comes to Wendy is Breast Cancer Show Ever from season 12, where she challenges Cartman to a fight and then beats him up in front of the entire school, thoroughly. This episode is extraordinary precisely because the show commits to it. Wendy has been angry at Cartman for a long time about something specific, and she decides to do something about it, and it works. The show doesn't undercut the moment. It doesn't walk it back. Wendy fights Cartman and wins, and the episode ends with her standing over him. And that's the episode. For a show that often treats its female characters as punchlines or props, that episode is, and I choose this word carefully, respectful. Wendy is taken seriously, her anger is taken seriously, her ability to follow through is taken seriously. Sharon Marsh, Stan's mom, Randy's long-suffering wife, is probably the most human adult female character in the show. She is the person who understands exactly what Randy is and loves him anyway, and finds herself periodically at the end of her tether because of this and comes back anyway. Her marriage to Randy is depicted as real in a way that a lot of fictional marriages aren't, not simply functional or simply broken, but genuinely complex, with affection and frustration running simultaneously. They separate in You're Getting Old, the Stan cynicism episode. It feels real. The reconciliation in the follow-up also feels real and also slightly fragile in the way that real reconciliations are. Leanne Cartman is one of South Park's most interesting female characters precisely because the show refuses to simplify her. She is, by any conventional reading, an enabling parent who has created a monster. She gives Cartman everything. She absorbs everything. She does not set limits. And yet the show keeps returning to moments of genuine warmth between them, moments that suggest Leanne is not simply a device for producing Cartman's dysfunction, but a real person with her own story, her own loneliness, her own very specific love for this very specific child. Her backstory has been complicated by the show across the seasons. There are things about her past that the show has used as plot points and then stepped back from. Her relationship to Cartman's father, her own vulnerabilities. The show has not always treated her consistently, but the emotional core of Leanne, a person who loves her son completely, and perhaps not wisely in a way that has not made him easier to love, feels like something real, strong woman who became part of the main cast alongside PC Principal in the later seasons represents a different kind of South Park female character, fully capable, his equal in every way, not defined by her relationship with him even as that relationship is depicted. She has her own positions, her own conflicts, her own sense of what's right. The show didn't turn her into a foil for peasy principle or a softening influence on him. She just exists alongside him, which is the appropriate thing. The show has always had a complicated relationship with its female characters. There are episodes that handle them well and episodes that handle them badly, and both of those things are true simultaneously and across the same long run. But the ones who broke through, Wendy, Sharon, Liane, did so because the writers found something real in them, something that resisted being simple. That's worth acknowledging. One of the stranger things about South Park, stranger the more you think about it, is that it doesn't really have memory, not in the usual sense. The town resets every week back to baseline. Characters who had dramatic experiences last episode seem to have filed them away somewhere inaccessible. For the early seasons, this was just the format, a gag-based show that didn't pretend to have continuity. And that was fine, but as the show got older, the reset became a deliberate choice rather than a format necessity. Parker and Stone had the option of building real serialization. They showed they could do it in the Hybrid seasons, in the Imagination Land trilogy, in the Coon and Friends arc, in the heavily serialized season 20. They were capable of continuity. They sometimes chose it deliberately. The fact that they also kept the reset going in parallel, kept the episodic format alive alongside the serialized threads, says something interesting. The reset is part of the show's philosophy, not just its format. The world goes back to baseline because the show is about patterns, not about growth. The lesson is never learned. The cycle runs again. That's not a failure of the writing, it's the point. There are exceptions. The big, long-running threads, Kenny's mythology, Randy's Tegrity Farms arc, the Cartman-Heidi relationship, the PZ principal storyline, are allowed to accumulate across seasons. And when they're allowed to accumulate, they become the show's most interesting material. Kenny's deaths stopped being funny only once they'd built up enough history. Randy became South Park's most compelling character because the show let him have 20 seasons of developing before it gave him a full arc. The show also has a strange relationship with real-world time. It started in the late 90s and the boys are still in 4th grade. They have not aged. They will presumably not age. This is normal for animated shows. The Simpsons has been doing it for longer, but South Park is unusually self-aware about it. The world outside the show has changed enormously since those early seasons. The show's characters have processed those changes in real time through satire while standing completely still in their own personal timelines. They are eternal 4th graders commenting on an endlessly changing world. There's something quietly strange about that. Something I find hard to put words around that isn't quite nostalgia and isn't quite melancholy. The boys at the bus stop will be standing in the same snow in another 10 years, probably, if the show keeps going. The world around them will have changed completely again. They will still be 10. There's also the question of the show's meta-awareness. South Park has played with the idea that the characters know they're in a show, not constantly, not as a defining premise, but occasionally and pointedly. There are moments where the show acknowledges its own artifice, where Cartman most often seems to have access to knowledge he shouldn't have, where the rules of the world break down just far enough to suggest that the world knows it has rules. The most sustained example of this is the Imagination Land trilogy from season 11, which is probably the show's most ambitious narrative experiment. The world of imagination, populated by fictional characters from every story and game and film ever made, turns out to be real, with genuine geopolitical stakes. The arc plays with the relationship between fiction and reality in a way that is simultaneously crude and philosophical. It ends with the implication that everything imagined is real in some sense, that the act of imagination has weight. For a show that often seems determined to deflate weight wherever it finds it, that's a quietly radical position. I think about the Imagination Land trilogy more than I probably should, given that it involves, at various points, a government conspiracy and Cartman trying to collect on a bet. But there's something in the central idea, the reality of imagined things, the gravity of fiction, that resonates with what the show has been doing for 28 years. Making things up, making the things it makes up matter, finding the real underneath the absurd. That's what the best of South Park does, and it's why, sitting here at whatever hour this is for you, it's still worth talking about. Before we get to the wind down, I want to talk about a few specific details that I find genuinely delightful and that don't fit neatly into any of the character sections. The voice cast is a fun one. Trey Parker voices Stan, Cartman, Randy, Mr. Garrison, Mr. Mackey, Timmy, Tweak, Craig, Clyde, Jimmy, and a significant number of minor characters. Matt Stone voices Kyle, Kenny, Butters, and several others. The show's main cast is essentially two men and their collaborators covering the full range of human experience in a Colorado mountain town. Parker in particular does an extraordinary number of distinct voices. All the boys are him, all the key adults are him, and you can hear them as him if you're listening closely, but they're also completely distinct as characters. That's a technical achievement that doesn't get mentioned enough. Isaac Hayes voiced Chef, obviously, as we talked about earlier. But here's a fun casting detail. George Clooney barked for Stan's dog in season 1. Jay Leno provided the meow sounds for Cartman's cat in the same season. Henry Winkler, the Fonz, for those playing at home, grunted as a monster. These were not prominent roles. These were, in at least one case, literally animal sounds. The show has never been overly reverent about its celebrity appearances. Radiohead voiced themselves in Scott Tenorman Must Die, which we talked about, but what I always find interesting about that cameo is how perfectly chosen it is. There's something very specific about having Radiohead, a band whose entire aesthetic is melancholy and existential weight, show up to tell a crying child that they're lame. The tonal contrast is the joke. It's very precise comedy. The original Spirit of Christmas shorts, the animations that led to the show being commissioned, were made in 1992 and 1995. The 1992 short is primitive, barely resembling the show that came from it. The 1995 short is much more recognizable. They were passed around on VHS tapes at first, which for anyone who is old enough to remember VHS tapes passed around as cultural objects, tells you something about the era. This was underground distribution before underground had the internet as an infrastructure. The show uses construction paper as its visual metaphor. The flat, cutout look is intentional, a reference to the physical animation technique of the original shorts. In the early seasons, they actually used construction paper. Within a few seasons, it was all digital, but designed to look like construction paper. The technique stayed, the texture stayed. The artificiality of it is part of the show's visual honesty. It doesn't pretend to be real, it doesn't need to. One detail about the show's production timeline that I always share when it comes up, the episode About Last Night aired the day after the 2008 US presidential election. It depicted the election results accurately as it turned out and the show's response to those results. Parker and Stone wrote multiple endings and only finished the episode once the results came in, staying up through the night. It aired the next day. That's an extreme version of what the show does every week, but it illustrates why the show has always felt current in a way other animation doesn't. They literally stay up all night to make it current. Kenny's muffled voice is worth a brief mention. What Kenny actually says under that hood is usually audible if you listen carefully, or you can find transcripts online, and people have compiled them. He's frequently saying things that are extremely inappropriate for a child his age, and the muffling serves as a kind of protective obscurity. You can hear it if you try, and what you hear is usually shocking, and then you have to decide whether you wanted to hear it. It's a neat trick, the performance of innocence through deliberate obfuscation. The show has been broadcast internationally in a substantial number of countries, and different countries have handled the censorship differently. Some episodes that air largely unedited in the United States have been significantly cut or banned outright elsewhere. The Scientology episode, the one that preceded Isaac Hayes' departure, was famously pulled from UK broadcast at short notice by the network. Parker and Stone's response, again, was not especially diplomatic. These little production details are, I think, part of what makes South Park a genuinely interesting object to study beyond just the content of the episodes. It's a show about how it's made as much as what it says. I've been thinking, while we've been going through all of this, about why people keep coming back to South Park. Not in the abstract, in the specific. Why this show, after nearly 30 years on air, still finds new viewers, still has the existing audience returning, still generates the kind of conversation that keeps it relevant in a media landscape that now contains an almost incomprehensible number of alternatives. The obvious answers are the obvious answers. It's funny, it's well made within its own specific parameters. It responds to current events with a speed that creates a sense of participation. Watching South Park feels, in some seasons, like watching live commentary on the week's news. Those are real reasons, and they account for a real portion of the audience. But I think there's something else. I think South Park, underneath all the provocation, is a show about permanence, about the stubborn, unremarkable persistence of ordinary things. The boys are always there, the town is always there, the snow always falls, that same street always waits. Whatever happened, the reset we talked about earlier does its work, and then we're back. The chaos was real. The chaos is over. That rhythm has a particular comfort to it that I think people feel without always being able to name. Something happened. We processed it in the funniest and most outrageous and sometimes most genuinely moving way available. And then we reset. We do it again next week. There's a line of thought that says, this makes South Park nihilistic, that the reset implies nothing matters, that growth is impossible, that the whole exercise is pointless. I don't think that's right. I think the reset implies something more interesting, that life keeps going regardless of the disasters it contains, and that the persistence of ordinary things is itself a kind of grace. 4 figures in the snow talking about something. The mountains somewhere behind it all, invisible but implied. That image has been going for nearly 3 decades. It will keep going probably for as long as Parker and Stone keep making the show. And long after that, it will be there in the archive. 4 kids in the snow, talking, waiting. There's something to that. I also think, if I'm being honest with myself, that what a lot of people come back to South Park for is the specific feeling of being let in on something. The show has always operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The broad joke on the surface, the social satire underneath, and occasionally something more personal and more precise under that. When you catch the 3rd level, when you see the thing the show was really doing, there's a small private satisfaction in that, a sense of being read correctly. Good satire does that. It makes you feel recognized, not just seen, recognized. The specific texture of your frustration with the world reflected back at you with enough accuracy that you feel less alone in it. South Park, at its best, makes me feel less alone in my frustration with how collective human behavior works. Not because it offers solutions, it very specifically doesn't, but because it names things accurately and with genuine anger at the same time as finding them genuinely funny. And that combination is rare and specific, and for me, lands every single time it's done properly. That's a personal thing, obviously. Other people will come back for other reasons. The characters, the nostalgia, the way it feels to watch something you've been watching since you were young. The specific pleasure of a show that refuses to be afraid of anything. Whatever brings you back, though, here it is. Still going. 4 kids, a bus stop, snow. I think we're ready for the end now. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. Stan and his quietly personal connection to the man who made him. Cartman and the extraordinary amount of psychological architecture required to hold such a fundamentally strange character together across 28 seasons. Kenny, who has been living through something genuinely terrible for years and had the grace to mostly keep it to himself. Kyle, who keeps being right and keeps being ignored. and who will almost certainly be back at it again next episode. Butters in his aluminium foil helmet, Randy and his farm, Chef, and the regret that surrounds his exit from the show, Craig and his perfect flat unflappability, PC Principal, who arrived as a joke and became something more interesting, Tolkien and the name that turned out to have a whole story behind it, Wendy, who fought Cartman in a school car park and won, Sharon, who loves Randy in spite of everything and sometimes because of it, Leon, whose love for her terrible son is one of the show's stranger ongoing mysteries, a town that resets every week and is somehow, through all of that, still standing. I've enjoyed spending this time here with all of them. I always do when I start pulling at these threads. You think you know a show after watching it for 20 years, and then you start looking at the specific details and you realize there are layers you weren't fully attending to. That the gag you laughed at in season 3 has something more precise underneath it. That the character you dismissed as background has been doing something interesting in the margins all along. South Park rewards that kind of attention, not always. There are episodes that are exactly as simple as they appear. There are seasons that are stronger than others. There are jokes that haven't aged well and jokes that have aged into something unexpectedly poignant. It is not a perfect show. It is a very specific show with very specific sensibilities, made by people who are very clear about what they find funny and what they find worth saying. But at its best, and its best is genuinely something, it's one of the most formally inventive, emotionally surprising, and intellectually honest comedies that television has produced. Which is a sentence I could imagine making anyone's eyes go wide if I said it about a show that contains a character called Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh. But there we are. Let me talk about one more thing, and then I'll let you sleep. The bus stop. The bus stop scene is, I think, South Park's most honest image. The bus stop scene happens at the beginning of some South Park episodes, mainly in the earlier seasons. 4 kids in their characteristic outfits, Stan in red, Kyle in green, Cartman in red jacket and blue hat, Kenny in orange, standing at the bus stop on their street talking. What they're talking about changes every time. The weather, something that happened at school, an opinion about something, a complaint, a curiosity, sometimes something that has nothing to do with the episode that follows. Just kids talking, just time passing while they wait for the bus. That scene has been happening since the very first episode. Think about that for a moment, at whatever hour it is where you are. The world in 1997 and the world now are barely recognizable to each other. The internet has completely restructured how human beings relate to information, to each other, to politics, to entertainment, to time itself. Institutions have changed. Technologies have arrived and disappeared. Cultural moments that felt defining have been forgotten completely. People who were children in 1997 are now in their late 30s and early 40s, raising children of their own. And every week for those 28 years, 4 paper-cut children have stood at a bus stop in the snow in Colorado and talked. There's a kind of immortality in that. Not a dramatic one, not the tragic immortality of Kenny, caught in his endless cycle with nowhere to put the knowledge of it. A quieter kind. The immortality of a habit, of something that just keeps happening because it keeps happening, because it's always been that way, because that's where they've always stood and the snow is always falling and there is always something to talk about. I find that comforting. I don't entirely know why. Maybe it's the permanence of it. In a world where almost nothing is permanent, the South Park bus stop keeps showing up. Maybe it's the mundanity of it. Kids talking about nothing in particular while waiting for the bus is one of the most ordinary images imaginable. And the show keeps returning to it as an anchor, no matter how extraordinary the events of the episode become. Maybe it's just that 28 years of anything is long enough to take on a kind of weight, a kind of meaning by accumulation that no individual moment could carry. 4 kids, a bus stop, snow. That's the whole show in some ways. Everything else is an elaboration. I've got a few videos I'm planning that would fit nicely alongside this one if you're interested. I want to spend some time with the Imagination Land trilogy, which is, I think, underrated as a piece of storytelling even by people who love the show. And there's a whole video I'd like to do on the show's relationship with celebrity culture, which has its own very specific history and its own very specific complications. Those are a little way off, but they're coming. For now, though, wherever you are, whatever time it is, however comfortable or restless you're feeling tonight, I hope this has been a pleasant way to spend a few hours. I hope something in it caught your interest, or made you think of something you hadn't thought of in a while, or just gave you something to listen to that was warm and not demanding. Sleep well. The bus stop will still be there in the morning. There are episodes of South Park that aired, and in some small way, the show was different afterward. Not always in ways audiences noticed immediately. Sometimes it took a few seasons for the implication of something to fully land. But these particular episodes are the ones I come back to when I want to understand what the show has been attempting over the years. The moments where it tested itself, pushed against its own limits, and found out what was on the other side. The first one is Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5, which we talked about in the Cartman section. But I want to name it again here specifically as a turning point in what the show could ask of itself. Before that episode, Cartman was awful and funny. After it, Cartman was awful and interesting. The episode established that South Park could sustain genuine psychological complexity inside its crude cartoon frame, that a character could have a real interior without the show losing its comedic identity. Everything the show has done with Cartman since, every scheme, every manipulation, every strange flicker of something almost like feeling, flows from what Scott Tenorman Must Die made possible. The second is Make Love, Not Warcraft from Season 10. This episode is, in a technical sense, extraordinary. It was filmed extensively using the actual World of Warcraft game engine, integrating machinima footage into the show's usual animation in a way that had never been done on television before. But what I find more interesting than the technique is what the episode is doing thematically. It's a love letter to a particular kind of obsessive nerdiness, made by people who clearly understand it from the inside rather than mocking it from outside. The boys are ridiculous in this episode. They're also sympathetic and funny, and the episode ends with them being genuinely heroic in the most absurdly specific context imaginable. It's the show at its most affectionate, which is rarer than its most provocative moments. The third is You're Getting Old from Season 15, which we talked about in the Stan section. I name it again here because it's the most unusual structural experiment the show has run. It's a South Park episode in which South Park honestly doesn't know if it wants to keep going. The grief underneath it is real. The honesty is unusual. For a show that usually handles its own emotions with layers of deflection and irony, this episode just holds the feeling there without many excuses for it. It's the most vulnerable the show has ever been. The fourth is Coon and Friends, the full trilogy from Season 14. This is where Kenny stopped being a running joke and became a mythology. We've talked about this in depth, but I want to name it here as a category of thing that the show demonstrated it could do. Build a genuinely affecting piece of dark fantasy mythology inside a format that was usually interested in only the immediate and the satirical. The trilogy is patient. It builds over multiple episodes. It holds its reveals until they land properly. It treats Kenny as a protagonist with a real interior life and a real tragedy at his center. That's a significant creative achievement done within the constraints of a 6-day production schedule, with the same paper-cut aesthetic and the same crude comedic register the show had always operated in. The fifth, and this is the more personal one, is Band Geeks from Season 4, which is not, strictly speaking, a character secret episode or a dark mythology episode or an experimentally structured episode. It's just the one where Squidward is a SpongeBob character. The one where the secondary characters of South Park come together around Squidward's musical ambitions and produce something that surprises everyone, especially Squidward. Again, I've done it. Let me try again. band Geeks is from a different show entirely, as I'm sure you've noticed. What I mean to say is that the closest South Park has to that kind of episode, the one where an unlikely group comes together and achieves something beautiful in spite of everything, is probably Tst from season 10, where a dog trainer manages to temporarily break through Cartman's psychology, or Le Petit Tourette from season 11, where Cartman tries to fake Tourette's syndrome for personal gain and ends up accidentally saying genuinely vulnerable things, or the end of Guitar Queer O from season 11, which ends with Stan and Kyle's friendship reaffirmed after being strained over the course of the episode. Small moments, small episodes, the ones where the characters remember that they like each other under all the noise. Those are the episodes I find myself watching last on late nights before I close the laptop. Not the legendary ones, not the technically ambitious ones. The ones where the boys are just, briefly, genuinely friends. There are a few more small things I want to mention before we're really done, because they're the kind of things that don't fit anywhere else and don't deserve to be left out. The show's music is underrated, not the licensed songs, and South Park has made excellent use of licensed music at key moments, Primus doing the theme being the most obvious example. But the original compositions by Bruce Howell and Adam Berry, and later the score work that runs under individual episodes. The show has its own musical vocabulary that has been developing since season 1. There are motifs that recur across episodes and seasons. There's actual craft in the audio. The closing credits music, the slower, mostly instrumental version of the Primus rock theme that plays over the end credits of most episodes, is one of those things that I think lodges itself in the brain of anyone who has watched the show regularly. It's a small thing, but it signals the end of the episode, the beginning of the reset, the show breathing out. It's the audio equivalent of that opening image of 4 kids standing in the snow. The show has also, over the years, produced a genuinely remarkable number of musical set pieces, songs that were written for single episodes and then escaped into the wider culture. Christmas Time in Hell, Uncle Fucka, Chocolate Salty Balls, Blame Canada, which was nominated for an Academy Award and performed at the ceremony in 2000. The South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut film was essentially a fully staged musical, and a very good one at that. Parker, who went to music school and who co-wrote the musical The Book of Mormon after South Park, brings a genuine musical sensibility to the show that gets taken for granted because the context is so deliberately crude. That feels worth saying. The songs are good. They're actually good, not just funny and crude. They're constructed well. They do what songs are supposed to do. And the show has produced a considerable number of them across its long run. One more detail. The town of South Park is depicted as part of Park County, Colorado, a real administrative county. The show takes some liberties with the geography of the actual county, and the fictional town bears only a thematic resemblance to the real place. But there is a real South Park, and people from the real South Park have, over the decades, had varying relationships with the show's existence. By most accounts, local reactions have been mixed in the way that local reactions to something loud and famous usually are mixed. Some people amused, some people exhausted, most people just going about their business. The mountains that surround the fictional South Park are real mountains. The altitude is real altitude. The particular quality of cold that the show implies with all that snow and all those winter coats is a real Colorado winter thing. Parker grew up in it. It's in the DNA of the show in ways that are easy to overlook, but that you start to feel once you start noticing them. The show is, in some genuine sense, about a specific place, even as it uses that place to talk about everywhere. The sky above South Park is a Colorado sky. The flat, vast, high-altitude sky that you don't get at sea level. I've never been to Colorado, but I feel like I have a picture of it in my head from 20 years of watching this show. Snow on flat ground, mountains somewhere behind it, a sky that goes on forever, 4 kids in the snow talking. I realize I've been talking for quite a while. That's usually what happens when I start pulling at a thread in something I care about. There's always one more thing, One more detail that feels important to mention. One more character who deserves a paragraph. The show has a lot of it, and I've barely scratched the surface tonight. There are whole categories of things we haven't touched. The movie. The bigger, longer, and uncut film from 1999, which is arguably the most technically accomplished thing Parker and Stone have made, and which deserves its own several hours. The video game The Stick of Truth and its sequel, which are the only tie-in games I can think of that feel like genuine extensions of the work rather than cash grabs. The specials. The COVID specials, which were doing some genuinely strange and interesting things with time and consequence and the show's own mythology. I'll leave all of that for another night. What I can tell you, after all this time spent with these characters, is that South Park is stranger and more careful than it usually gets credit for being. The crudeness is real, the provocations are real, the offense is real and sometimes has to be reckoned with directly. But underneath all of that, there is craft. There is consistency. There is a very long run of two people staying interested in the same world and the same characters and finding new things to say about them. That's rare. The show that started with a Christmas poo and an alien probe has, by 2025, developed a mythology that encompasses cosmic Lovecraftian horror, a careful portrait of midlife crisis, one of the strangest celebrity departure narratives in television history, and a reasonably affecting love story between a paranoid principal and his vice principal colleague. These things all happen in the same show, in the same crude paper-cut world, with the same 4 kids in the snow in the opening. The absurdity of all that, considered together, is its own kind of beauty. Sleep well tonight. Whatever corner of the world you're in, whatever the hour, I hope the blanket is warm and the pillow is right and the night is quiet enough for rest. We've been somewhere interesting together this evening and I'm glad of the company. The bus stop will still be there tomorrow. 4 kids, a Colorado morning, snow on everything.